Hi, I am Casimir Saturnus. This video will demonstrate how to run Microsoft's SQL Server on a Mac using Docker. Docker allows you to run software in containers. Originally, it only could be run on Linux, but at this point it can be run natively on Mac or Windows. Docker for Mac is the preferred method for modern Macs. Older versions of OS X can run Docker Toolbox instead. This option runs Docker inside of a Linux virtual machine on the Mac. We will demonstrate both in this video. There are a few configuration notes to keep in mind when running SQL Server. You need to configure 4 gig of memory for Docker or the database won't start. The way you manage this configuration differs depending on whether you are running Docker for the Mac or Docker machine. SQL Server's database connection port is 1433. And this needs to be considered when making remote connections to the database. The default user is SA, and you define a password for this user when you start the container. We will demonstrate remote database connections using JDBC through Aquadata Studio. First, let's look at Docker for the Mac. Click the whale in the status bar to configure the memory available to a container. When you change the value using the slider, the Apply and Restart button is enabled so that you can click the value and make the change. Since the value is already set to 4 gigabytes, in this case we just close the window to continue. To download the Docker container that includes SQL Server running on Linux, you need to run the docker pull command followed by the name of the image. In this case, Microsoft/MSSQL-server-Linux. The download can take some time, which will vary based on your connection speed and network traffic. Once the download completes, you should see a message confirming a successful download. In this case, a digest and status is included. Next, we will actually create a running container using the Docker image just downloaded. The command is broken up over a few lines using backslashes to help clarify the options in use. The -D option stands for detach and runs the container in the background. The container ID is printed to the console when -D is specified. The -P option specifies the port mapping between the container and the host. In this case, SQL Server will be listening on host port 1433. The -E option is used to set environmental variables on the running machine. In this case, they're used to specify a password and to accept the end user license agreement. Note that the password is enclosed in single quotes to avoid problems with the shell interpreting special characters. Finally, the image that will be used to create the container is identified by name. Having executed the docker run command, we can run a docker ps command to list running Docker processes and see that a container has been created based on the Microsoft SQL Server Linux image. Let's log into the running Docker image and have a look at the processes that are running on it. Use the docker exec command with the -I and -T options to indicate that we're running interactively at the command line, followed by the shell to use, in this case the bash shell. Having logged into the running Docker container, we can see the SQL Server is running by running ps-ef. Let's make a remote connection to the SQL Server database from Aquadata Studio. The same basic connection information is used regardless of what database client software you choose to use. The database type is MS SQL Server. This takes care of the database driver configuration. With other database clients, you'll have to select and configure either ODBC or JDBC drivers. The login name is SA. The password is password111! That's the same one we used when we started the container. The container is running on my local machine. 127.0.0.1 can be entered as the server name. And the database port is the default, 1433. We can now use this database connection and view which databases are available using the GUI or by executing SQL statements. To show that everything is in working order, we'll create a new database called test_db1. We'll view the new database using the GUI and by executing the same query executed earlier. In both cases, the new database appears in the listing. Now we can specify the new testdb1 database as the context for subsequent statements with a use statement. We will create a new table called items and insert a couple of records into this table. We have used DDL, data definition language, to create a table and DML, data manipulation language, to add records. Now let's do a query to see the contents of the items table. 2 records exist as expected. We can delete one of the records by ID and see the table results are indeed updated. Finally, we'll drop the table to wrap up this database session. If you're planning on using Docker for Mac, that's all you need to see. Thanks for watching. If you're using Docker Toolbox, for instance, if you're using an older version of OS X, keep watching to see the additional steps that you need to perform to get the SQL Server image working. The first thing to do when using Docker Toolbox is assign sufficient memory to the underlying virtual machine. If you've ever run Docker Machine before, you already have a VM on your system with insufficient memory allocated. Run Docker Machine rm default to remove the VM, followed by a Docker Machine create command that assigns 4 GB of memory to the machine. To be clear, this virtual machine or VM is running on VirtualBox. The VM will be running Linux with Docker installed. The SQL Server Docker image will run inside of the VirtualBox machine. The VirtualBox VM has its own private IP address. Run Docker machine env to see the Docker host environmental variable, which includes the IP. The environmental variables are used to create a shell session where Docker commands can be run. The next few steps look exactly the same as those done when running Docker for Mac. Run a Docker pull command to download the SQL Server image. And once that's downloaded, run the Docker run command to kick off a new container based on that image. The container ID will be displayed when you execute the run command, and you can run Docker PS to see additional details about the running container. We can also log into the SQL Server Docker container and confirm that the SQL Server database is running. Because we are using 2 levels of virtualization, Docker inside of a VirtualBox VM on our Mac laptop, we have to take one additional step to allow the container to accept remote connections. Open the VirtualBox Manager and click on Settings, Network, and Port Forwarding. You can see that only one port is open by default, the one required for logging in via SSH. We need to add a mapping of port 1433 so that a connection made on the host machine will be passed through the VirtualBox VM to the Docker container where SQL Server itself is running. With that last bit of VirtualBox configuration complete, we can make a remote database connection from Aqua Data Studio. Rather than specifying 127.0.0.1 or localhost, we need to specify the IP address that was listed by the Docker machine env command for the Docker host earlier. Other than that adjustment, all remaining settings used are the same as those used with Docker for Mac. At this point, the SQL Server database looks exactly the same as what we saw during the Docker for Mac demonstration. We can list databases, create a database, add a table, add records to the table, delete records, and drop the table. In short, we have an operational SQL Server database on our own local machine in an isolated environment available for experimentation. That wraps up our introduction to running SQL Server in a Docker container on a Mac. I hope this presentation was helpful. If you like this video, say so in the comments or check out my blog at rchart.com where I post about the R programming language. That's r-chart.com. Thank you for watching.